This channel has always focused on telling the true stories of disasters, be it Chernobyl or otherwise. We've done a lot on this, from examining the chain of events leading up to the explosion, to the actions of operators on the day of the disaster. But it would be impossible to tell the true story without also examining the other side. What was happening at the nuclear power plant? These are the forgotten elements of Chernobyl, ones that many might claim influenced the scale of the disaster. We're all familiar with Anatoli Diatlov, and many are also aware of his time before Chernobyl, working at a submarine plant. In fact, he played a role in a nuclear accident here, where he was also exposed to a rather large dose of radiation. After the death of his son, Diatlov moved away from the east of the Russian SSR to Ukraine and would work his way up to deputy chief engineer. But what very few people talk about is the importance of Diatlov's work at the Lewinsky Komsomol shipyards, for the nuclear power plant anyway. Diatlov was a very senior worker, directly leading the assembly of the active zones of reactors. Now, some of these will have accidents, but they mostly aren't his fault, and by the time he left, he had been promoted to the head of the physics laboratory. While Diatlov may not have been well liked by his employees, or sometimes even his employers, he was certainly well respected, and many did keep in contact with Diatlov after he left for the Western Soviet nuclear industry. We all know the rest of the story. Diatlov works at Chernobyl. He rises through the ranks due to his hard work and intelligence, and of course his tough nature. And by early 1983, he beats Nikolai Steinberg for deputy chief engineer. During this time, the nuclear power plant has grown to 3 units, with a 4th well on the way, and there are now many positions available that are not only senior, but well paying. And this goes back into why the Ukrainian Communist Party sided with Diatlov's promotion over Steinberg, his connection to the Komsomol shipyard, and why would the Komsomol employees stay if they were called by their former boss? Komsomol was a city built for industry, and not for personal enjoyment. Pripyat, in comparison, was a very nice city in a green area, warm in summer, and with direct connection to the capital by hydrofoil. And so, in came the Komsomol employees. One of the men who arrived was Anatoly Sitnikov, a good friend of Diatlov, with their families often getting together for celebrations such as Women's Day. In 1985, Sitnikov became the deputy chief engineer for Units 1 and 2. Now both units were controlled by people who were once senior workers at the shipyards, and their influence was absolute. If you weren't an old employee of the nuclear power plant like Akimov, or effectively a prodigy like Toptonov, your chances of promotion were pretty low. The exception was of course for the Komsomol shipyard workers, who had friends in high places. Dozens of people left Chernobyl for other nuclear power plants, in the hopes of making their way up the ranks there, including those who followed Steinberg to Balakovo nuclear power plant. Those that remained at Chernobyl were heavily demoralized, while the Komsomol faction of the nuclear power plant grew increasingly powerful. The Komsomol shipyard's grasp on the power plant was only ended with the explosion of Unit 4. Sitnikov would receive a fatal dose of radiation surveying the plant, and Diatlov was of course imprisoned and never returned to the nuclear power plant, which ultimately claimed his health. But it is worth talking about the nepotism of the nuclear power plant, reported on by those in Pripyat and who worked there. You could not find work at the nuclear power plant if you were an average worker, and it was very difficult as a brilliant worker. The easiest way to get in was to be friends with senior management, and rising through the ranks suddenly became incredibly easy as a result. Criticism of one person would be seen as an attack against everyone, and they would leap to their defense. The administration was effectively considered immune from attack, and would regularly berate and attack those beneath them, without any worry of retaliation. Some people tried to go to the newspapers and beg to anonymously call out the behaviour of these people, But they never got the chance, as these publications were going to be made after April of 1986. Tangentially, even Viktor Brukhanov, the director of the nuclear power plant at the time, got involved in these unusual plant politic events. One of his many suggestions repeatedly was to demote the senior reactor control engineer down to just a reactor control engineer, while keeping the senior turbine control engineer position, on the grounds that a reactor is more easily controlled than a turbine. Even Diatlov stepped in here, calling out this potentially dangerous line of thought, and it never went through. While most of the plant had this battle between the Komsomol shipyard and those who were not former workers, the senior leadership had to battle the Communist Party, as it tried to assert control over the nuclear power plant. Director Brukhanov had, for at least some time before the Chernobyl disaster, dealt with increasingly unusual proposals from the Communist Party, not limited to building mincemeating machines on the territory of the nuclear power plant. They also demanded that the builders of the nuclear power plant, experts in building concrete structures, and, of course, nuclear reactors, build collective farms in the local region. Did I mention they were not even provided the resources to build these collective farms? On April 25th, Viktor Brukhanov was not at the nuclear power plant. He was in Kiev, meeting with party officials. They weren't there to praise him. Instead, they were asking why he hadn't assembled the frames for a barn at a collective farm, when they didn't even have the frames to begin with. But it also wasn't just that. The party had spent months trying to force through boundary changes to remove Pripyat from Brukhanov's control. Sure, there were talks of a promotion, but it seems in interviews that Brukhanov was always hesitant to leave Pripyat and Chernobyl behind. Many countries, including Czechoslovakia and Cuba, wanted to steal Brukhanov to build their nuclear power plants, but he refused. Even with the better pay offers, he was still attached to the city. Where Brukhanov was strained by the Communist Party, Fomin was effectively useless for the nuclear power plant, and had been for months. In 1985, Fomin was involved in a car accident, flipping the car over and breaking his coccyx, leaving him effectively paralysed until he recovered. And when he did, his mental well-being and general physical health were ruined. Fomin returned earlier than he should have in the hopes that work would help him recover quicker. But this instead resulted in Fomin slacking on his required duties, and becoming a smaller part of the nuclear power plant as a result. With the core leadership of the nuclear power plant in tatters, a major thing was happening behind the scenes. The deputy chief engineers, Sitnikov and Diatlov, were picking up the slack, and were having increasing control over nuclear power plant operations. Except Diatlov was also preparing for his own retirement, and had begun delegating his roles to more junior positions. The nuclear power plant was paralysed. Brukhanov and Fomin had more or less given up, and were planning on turning Units 5 and 6 into a separate nuclear power plant altogether, in the hopes of at least saving their control over the first 4 reactors. Of course, Brukhanov and Fomin lost their roles after the 1986 disaster, but they still had to obey the whims of the Communist Party. The Minister of Energy, Anatoli Diatlov, embarked on a campaign of maximising energy production by shortening maintenance downtime and increasing the time between them. In 1985, the nuclear power plant was awarded for superseding its electricity quotas by 10%, but it was going to fall short of this in 1986, upsetting the local Communist Party. Okay, so picture being Brukhanov in the early days of Chernobyl's construction, in the early 70s. Resources that were being sent in were more than subpar, with a lot of the reinforced concrete sent to the site being immediately thrown away. Steel and zirconium pipes were often unusable, forcing the nuclear power plant to sometimes manufacture their own. Every piece of equipment shipped over had to be stripped apart, fixed up, and reassembled before being installed, which drastically increased the time it took to build anything. In July of 1972, Brukhanov moved to resign as a result, but his resignation letter was torn up in front of him and he was sent back to work. The reason why the quality was so low was because these parts were not being manufactured by the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, a ministry specialising in nuclear power plant construction, but by the civilian Ministry of Energy that was building Chernobyl instead. Why contracts weren't signed with specialists is anybody's guess, but Diatlov effectively torpedoed many Ministry of Energy contracts simply through inaction. They also placed Diatlov in charge of securing new contracts, which somehow actually went well, organising materials from Ministry of Medium Machine Building plants and in Kiev. By Unit 4, they had realised that this was not working, and worked with the All-Union Research Institute for Nuclear Power Plant Operation, or VNIIAES, to get their materials. All employees used it as a bonus, which we know at least Diatlov spent on gas money for his car. But it wasn't just raw materials like pipes or concrete. The fireproof insulation for wires was never delivered, and no orders could be secured. They used flammable insulation. A fireproof roofing material could not be found. They used flammable bitumen, which would melt in the heat and make attempts to extinguish flames very difficult, especially for the firefighters that would have to do it in 1986. And in the end, it is definitely possible that this subpar construction came back to bite them multiple times, and not in the 1986 disaster. Of course, in 1984, we have the now much more well-known Unit 3 accident, where the insulation of the steam separators melted through, and the roof collapse in the Unit 2 turbine hall fire, which almost led to a meltdown, was caused by a lack of fireproofing on the roof supports. But also, one of the main theories behind the cause of the 1982 Chernobyl Unit 1 partial meltdown was defects in zirconium channels due to the nuclear power plant's self-made versions not being up to par in all cases. But the biggest victim of this was Unit 5. Supplies continued to arrive increasingly late, and production continued to fall behind. Combined with Minister Mayoretz deciding to shave 2 years off of the expected construction time of a new dual reactor building, everything was going wrong. In December of 1985, Mayoretz visited the site in order to speed up the progress, while also allowing the delivery of metal components to fall short by almost 2,500 tons. One of the few people to speak up was a writer and poet named Lyubov Kovalevskaya, whom on the 27th of March 1986 wrote an article calling out the poor construction efforts at the site. It was more than well deserved. Construction workers were literally awarded for pouring 10 cubic meters of concrete when the reactor was supposed to be fully assembled and operational in 8 months. But people fell into denial about Kovalevskaya's article, accusing her of being incompetent, of being half-educated, of airing their dirty laundry, or just trying to make a name for herself. Kovalevskaya was demoted from editor to correspondent, and the new editor effectively turned the column about the nuclear power plant of the Pripyat City Committee. Kovalevskaya was on very thin ice, finding out that they were preparing to summon her to the party office, to expel her as a member of the Communist Party. She was spared this fate by the Chernobyl disaster, and her words were instead treated as prophetic. While the leadership of Chernobyl always struggled with pretty much everything, the KGB had domineering control over things going on inside the nuclear power plant, and knew things better than even Brukhanov or Fomin likely did. They took rooms in the power plant, creating areas not even Brukhanov had authority to enter. With a network of informants in the building, they knew everything that happened, and not in terms of ratting on people specifically, but ratting on operations. Remember the 1984 accident? It was in fact a KGB informant who reported it first, and the KGB told the plant manager that their reactor building was close to collapse. Going back further, remember the 1982 accident? Despite the known radiation release, the KGB took direct efforts to suppress this information to prevent a panic, while radiation levels in some nearby villages peaked at hundreds of times above background. Fortunately, this is not a harmful dose, and background work to clean up was done, using street cleaners and resurfacing the roads of Pripyat. All operators were forced to sign gag orders, which continues to make research in this accident extremely difficult. We know what phone calls were made on the night of the disaster, because the KGB had wiretapped all phones and were listening in to every conversation. The KGB was also obviously in charge of security, and they regularly screened all employees as a security measure. The direct consequence of this is obvious. Nobody knew when accidents occurred, nor their causes. This should quite obviously be seen as more than dangerous, since other nuclear power plants would never find out, and the odds of them repeating were shot up. But the KGB weren't just interested in protecting the nuclear power plant through suppression of events, or physical guarding of it, but also through counter-espionage. Invitations to events outside the USSR were destroyed by the KGB, as they contained questionnaires about USSR nuclear energy. A witch hunt began in 1984 to find potential enemies of the state in Pripyat, as the number of Jewish and German residents had increased fivefold since 1979. While they never found anyone who was actually a spy, it instead turned up how many accidents were being spoken about by the citizens of Pripyat. And following on from that, let's trace through their archives to see what accidents up to April of 1986 were covered up by the KGB, and not really well known. Some of these are minor and relate to poor construction materials, but others are downright unusual. Keep in mind this is not an exhaustive list, it's just the highlights. Early 1973. Defective concrete was used in the basement of Unit 1 and the deaerator block. This caused the entire floor to shift downwards 10 centimeters into the ground. The fittings were also deemed not strong enough to hold up the structure. Mid-1973. The bitumen roof of the nuclear power plant was already melting at temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius. The fence was still missing, and random unauthorized citizens were walking into the site. Keep this in mind for another 30 or so seconds. March 1976. Improper installation of deaerator block stairs and turbine hole roofing was already causing holes to form in the floors and roofs. This had to all be replaced before Chernobyl Unit 1 was even online. April 1976. A 5,000 cubic meter concrete and steel tank containing liquid radioactive waste collapsed due to poor and hasty construction. September 1976. I promise I'm not making this up. Unknown people were able to bypass security due to guard shortages, break into the nuclear power plant by climbing through the ventilation system, made their way to a control room, and stole every single button, switch and transistor in there. January 1977. Similar to in September, unknown thieves broke into the nuclear power plant through a disused staircase and ransacked the place, stealing equipment that had been left aside, including transformers. They then made their way to Turbine 2 and looted electrical equipment there. March 1977. Every single button and switch in the water management board is also stolen. May 1977. The motor for the crane that carried nuclear fuel to the Unit 1 reactor hall disappeared without a trace. July 1978. Due to the inaccuracies in the installation of the support pillars that form the core of the building, 3 panels from Unit 2, weighing 3 tons each, fell to the ground, narrowly avoiding a group of workers underneath. The same month, a construction worker falls 5 meters onto reinforced concrete as no barriers were placed around the hole. He fractured his pelvis. August 1978. The M6000 computer intended for operation inside Units 1 and 2 is destroyed beyond use, at a cost of 120,000 rubles, or about 1 million USD today. The same month, 2 men are given 15 and 55% degree burns respectively, when poor welding materials are used and inevitably fail. September and October 1978. Multiple fires break out in Unit 2 and the turbine hall under construction due to electrical faults on worn-out equipment. No fire alarms or fire suppression is added in response. At the end of October, a locksmith fell down a ventilation shaft that was not covered, trapped in there for several hours, and suffered 2 fractured legs. February 1979. Unit 1 has an emergency shutdown as operators turn on a drainage system to reverse the loss of coolant water, which instead began pumping air into the coolant system of the reactor. July 1979. Improper waterproofing of the building's chemical water treatment plant causes wastewater to instead flood the cable corridors and fill the building. December 1980. Unit 2 has an emergency shutdown as operator Alexander Ryabushev saw what he believed to be a purge valve for the steam separator in the wrong position and opened it, draining the steam separator and causing a sudden loss of coolant water. April 1981. A pipeline from Unit 1 burst open, pumping contaminated water into the ground for several days until it was reported. An area of 180 square meters was contaminated up to 24,000 times background radiation, and was cordoned off. February 1982. A safety valve opens at Unit 3, causing a hydraulic shock through the building so strong it tears open a steam discharge pipe, causing an emergency shutdown of Chernobyl Unit 3. August 1982. An open switchgear connecting Chernobyl to the Vinnytsia electrical line closes on its own, causing a transformer to explode and starting oil fires around turbine number 5 as it was running up to the grid. The operators continued to synchronize turbine 5 while the fire was being put out. September 1982. A crane inside the turbine hall carrying a freshly repaired turbine rotor to turbine 1 is dropped from a height of 13.5 meters straight through the floor. It is installed anyway, leaving permanent damage to the blades. The same month, the reactor would suffer a severe partial meltdown, including parts of the fuel being carried all the way into the steam separators, as well as forced into the graphite stack. For the rest of its operation, the surrounding region inside Unit 1 was no longer functional. October or November 1982. Cables running underneath Control Room 3 catch fire during operation. December 1982. The concrete cooling system for Unit 4 is found to be seriously defective. May 1983. Multiple people break into the under construction Unit 4 through holes in the walls, again to loot electrical equipment. June 1983. It is discovered that the walls of Chernobyl Unit 4 are already corroding due to faulty and burst pipelines. Keep in mind the reactor is not supposed to be started up for another 6 months. And it is already corroding. July 1983. Units 1 and 2 have to be shut down for multiple periods of time to identify faulty channels leaking water into the graphite stack. September 1983. Construction workers are poisoned by being forced to drink dirty water on the construction site. Also, on September 18th, reactors 1 and 3 have emergency shutdowns, both within the same 6-hour period, due to high pressure and loss of feed water respectively. December 1983. It is calculated that 60,000 rubles worth of equipment has been stolen from Unit 4 in the last 6 months of construction alone. January 1984. It is found that the steam separators for Units 3 and 4 are extremely poor quality, as they were not manufactured in the USSR, but in Yugoslavia, using cheap materials bought from France. February 1984. The canteen of the administration building of Units 5 and 6 explodes due to someone lighting up a cigarette while installing waterproofing, fatally injuring worker Mikhail Anyulenko. March 1984. The insulation surrounding the steam separators of Unit 3 fails, causing the structure of the building to shift. Emergency work is performed on Units 3 and 4 to stabilise the structure. September 1984. About half of all the water flowing inside the cooling pond is found to be actually leaching out into the Pripyat River without decontamination. Fortunately, it is not heavily contaminated. March 1986. Construction of Unit 5 has effectively ground to a halt due to poor build quality and lack of supplies. April 1986. Chernobyl Unit 4 explodes as a result of severe design flaws. Bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. Nobody likes bureaucracy, not even bureaucrats. Unfortunately, bureaucracy dominated Chernobyl, and it would cause nightmares for many. A brief history lesson for those who have never heard this before. In late 1983, when Ignalina Unit 1 and Chernobyl Unit 4 were started up, the positive scram effect that would destroy Chernobyl Unit 4 was discovered for the first time. A letter was sent out to inform other nuclear power plants of the issue, including Kursk and Smolensk. But the designers of the RBMK never came up with an official solution. It took some experts from Kursk to find one that would work. Inside the RBMK are a series of shorter control rods that were designed to be inserted from the bottom, used to shape the neutron field inside the core, but they were never added to the emergency protection. If they added them, control rods would insert from the bottom, preventing insertion of positive reactivity and therefore any risk of a runaway. But adding these rods to the AZ-5 system was jammed up in bureaucracy. One after another, the feature was added to the Chernobyl reactors. First 1, then 2, then 3. Each time it would take months of meetings and preparations individually before work could be improved for a single unit, and then you would have to start on the next one. In the case of Unit 4, those meetings were just finished in April of 1986, and scheduled to be completed after the shutdown. Studies have since shown that, if the AZ-5 system also included these rods, the explosion would not have occurred. I wasn't really sure what to say here, beyond what is the real dark side of Chernobyl. Physically, the dark side of Chernobyl are the abandoned halls and corridors of the sarcophagus, never to be used again, and seen only by those mapping the gradual deterioration of the structure. The history of Chernobyl itself is dark. How many people have died or been injured as a result of the explosion or the many accidents that plagued the power plant? And this video is about the much more forgotten aspects, dark metaphorically. So I thought about this for a few minutes, listened to some Pink Floyd, which, yes, gave me the idea for the thumbnail, and then I remembered a quote from the end of the album that gave me an answer. There is no dark side of Chernobyl. Matter of fact, it's all dark.